Hi, everyone. So today we're going to start talking about the New Deal, which was FDR's response to the Great Depression. It's been 88 years since he took office, um, but we're still talking about it. Many of the programs that they implemented are still in place in the United States, and there's still a lot of debate about the New Deal. For those on the left, many people believe that FDR didn't go far enough. He could have gone further, maybe been more socialistic in his approach. So they would appreciate that. People on the right think that it went too far. Invariably, I mean, it did really expand the size of government exponentially. And people on the right feel that this is not the framers' intent, that it went beyond the scope of the Constitution. And even today, many people on the right think that you shouldn't be obligated by the federal government to put into a program Social Security, that you should be able to invest in your own retirement plan. So there's still a lot of debate about that. Some historians believe that FDR took a very moderate approach, and had he not done what he did, that perhaps there could have been this communist revolution or this socialist revolution that took place in the country. There were a lot of riots, especially like 1934, 1935, during that time period, and perhaps that could have happened, that could have spread had other events not taken place. After the Great Depression, and even when I was young, a lot of historians say, well, this brought us out of the Great Depression, the New Deal did. Most historians today and most economists today argue that that's not the case. What actually did bring us out of the Great Depression was World War II, because then America was gearing up for war production during that time. Also, now you even get quite a few historians and economists that believe that some of the actions that were taken by Hoover and by FDR actually exacerbated the Great Depression and made it last longer. One thing that Hoover did, and then FDR continued, Hoover increased taxes. It was during his administration, and then FDR did it too, to where people who were at the highest tax bracket had to pay like 90% in taxes, and it raised taxes for almost everybody. And so a lot of times, if you want to stimulate the economy, what you do is you cut taxes. Right, but in this case, they raised taxes. Another thing that the government did at this time through the National Industrial Recovery Act was actually force businesses to increase prices and increase wages, and that put a lot of people out of work. Now, labor had been working for a long time to be able to collectively bargain, to go on strike, to unionize, and they hadn't been able to. But because of the laws passed during the worst economic disaster in our nation's history, at this time of a depression, it's very ironic that labor gets all these gains and wins. So the cost of labor went up too, and that caused businesses to go out of business. So there's just a lot of different variables on a macroeconomic scale that some people look at and say, well, that exacerbated the Great Depression. Normally it would have been a panic and it would have alleviated itself, or the market would have fixed itself had it been given time and hands off. So there's a lot of debate, and a lot of that has to do too with people's political ideology, where they stand on the political spectrum. So anyway, keep that in mind where you are, because you might take in your own perceptions of it as we go through it. So let's go and look at some of the factual data. Okay, so Roosevelt becomes president when he wins the presidential election of 1932, but he won't be inaugurated until 1933, right? And actually March of 1933, because this was before the 20th Amendment, which is the Lame Duck Amendment. But anyway, Hoover, which surprises me that he's going to run. At that time, there were no political polls and that sort of thing. So maybe he just couldn't gauge the fact that he was unpopular throughout the country at that time. People blamed him because of the Great Depression. But really, it was just a matter of government really didn't take the sort of action that they do today to control the economy, and certainly not the New Deal. He did have certain things in place that they were working on, and perhaps if he had been president, who knows what would have happened in the next 4 years. Maybe it would have been like they thought, that there would have been some recovery. But like I said, he did raise taxes, and so there might have been some things that slowed recovery down. Anyway, FDR comes in, he's elected, he's quite popular. He kind of has this hoity New England sort of elite accent that was very popular at the time. But anyway, from a very wealthy family in New York. He was related to Teddy Roosevelt and also to Teddy's niece, Eleanor Roosevelt. He was fifth cousins. I've heard him described as fifth cousins with Eleanor and with Teddy, somewhere there, though there's a generation missing. But anyway, he went to Harvard, and that is where he fell in love with Eleanor, even though they had known each other since childhood. He'd been the governor of New York, and also, like Teddy, he was the assistant secretary of the Navy. He had been nominated as the vice presidential candidate with Cox. He was Cox's running mate in the 1920 presidential election, but of course, Harding won that. He chose John Garner as his vice presidential candidate. Garner, it was interesting, had been the Speaker of the House. He was from Texas. This was a time when a lot of times people chose their running mate based on geography, because you wanted to try, people had allegiance to people from their own state or their region. And so perhaps that's why he chose them. They had a falling out over the whole court packing thing. And then for Roosevelt's third term in office, he chose Henry Wallace. But then I'm not sure why. I'll have to check into that one. Then he chose for his fourth term in office Harry Truman, right? So Harry Truman's going to be vice president from January to April of 1945, and then he's going to become president. But anyway, so here's a map of the 1932 presidential election, and Roosevelt just wins by a huge margin, right? Hoover, even though he had been from Oregon, California, Iowa, he didn't win his home state. But he did get some states up in New England. He got some New England states, right? But it was an overwhelming victory, especially for the Electoral College for Roosevelt. Okay, so here's a picture of Roosevelt. He had polio. He became afflicted with that in 1921. There's some people say that, well, it wasn't really polio. It was something like polio that he had. But regardless, he was paralyzed. Most people didn't know that. He was in a wheelchair. The media didn't show it that way, and he did have the ability to walk with assistance. So sometimes, there might be newsreels of him. You can see him. People are holding on to him, or he's holding on to some rails on both sides. But what this did, many people felt, is gave him empathy for others. He could relate with those who struggled and that sort of thing. And he never really judged people. He was very open to that. Probably one of his greatest assets was his wife, Eleanor. She was loved by just about everybody. She really was a champion for the downtrodden, people who were minorities, right? And people who were poor, which a lot of people were at this time. People say he was an excellent speaker. Nowadays, I don't know that that would play well. It was a different time. What he did too is he got people around him who were experts in specific fields, and his cabinet was known as the Brain Trust. Okay, this is Eleanor. She kind of reminds me in some regards to Jane Addams, but she was orphaned at a young age, and she went off to boarding school in Europe, right? And she had worked at settlement houses. So she became very, very politically active, and she was kind of like the legs for her husband. She traveled around, she spoke with people, she shook hands, did all of those things. And after a while, really the relationship that she and her husband had was kind of more like a business relationship, business agreement. He was in love with another woman who was actually her personal secretary. When she first found out about it, and they had had 5 children, but when she first found out about it, he swore not to continue the relationship. But over time, that relationship was renewed, and Eleanor, from all accounts, knew of it, but it wasn't like flaunted in front of her face, and the media never made a spectacle of it. But she was right there in the administration. Okay, and one thing that she did, she wrote these columns, right, in newspapers, and she kind of put her 2 cents in on all sorts of um, different issues. It might have been about prohibition, anti-lynching. You could see a list of them over here. Improved working conditions. She advocated for a lot of these things and probably changed the minds of some people on some issues. You can go online, you can just type in My Day, and you could read any of these things that she wrote that are still around today. She talked about, why she resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution, of course, the whole Marian Anderson incident and that sort of thing. Okay, this is the family tree. So if you look right here, this is Teddy Roosevelt, right? And then this right here is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then Franklin married Anna Eleanor, whose father, Elliot, was the brother of Teddy. So Eleanor's, let's see, great, 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 great grandfather was Franklin Roosevelt's great, 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 great grandfather, right? So distant relationship. Was okay to marry, I guess, but in the same family nonetheless. Right. On Inauguration Day, FDR gives his inaugural speech, and he's very famous for saying, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And this is where he's saying, we need to go out and we need to try all of these different things. And he kind of proposed those things at this time. He didn't blame Hoover. He didn't do that. Who he blamed were these money changers, which, when you look at it, the people were buying on margin, buying all these stocks and everything else. That's what did cause it, right? And I just happened to notice, maybe you can see it too, that Abraham Lincoln attended the inauguration. I just noticed that person back there. But anyway, he said we need to wage a war on this depression. We need to do everything that we can. He also talked about, everybody's clustered in these population centers. If we could just spread them out throughout the country. So he kind of wanted to develop parts of the country. You're going to see one place where that was done was in the South. The Tennessee Valley Authority went down there and tried to improve situation there. So anyway, he outlined the concepts of the New Deal there in his inaugural address. All right, I had mentioned this to you before. The lame duck amendment had actually been proposed in March of 1932, so that was during the election year, but it wasn't ratified until January of 1933. And in it, it said that it would become effective in the same year that it was ratified. So it became effective of October of 1933. So that is why Roosevelt was inaugurated in March in his first term, right? So the lame duck amendment tried to shorten the time frame from where the president was elected until the president was inaugurated. In the past, presidents have used that to kind of ready themselves for their administration, but now it is shortened in order so that you don't have a president in office who's unable to get things done. It also talks about who's going to become president in the event that the president-elect dies from the time that that person is elected until they take office, right? Then it would go to the vice president. Okay, so the Brain Trust, these are a group of people who are around him. Some of the most noted are Harry Hopkins and Harold Ickes, and they kind of debated among themselves on what sort of projects to do. Harold Ickes was the Secretary of the Interior, and then Harry Hopkins was the Secretary of Commerce. Frances Perkins, you may recall, she's the one that witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and she becomes FDR's first woman. Well, actually, she becomes the first woman in our nation's history to serve in an executive branch position at that high of a level when she serves as the Secretary of Labor. Cordell Hull is the Secretary of State, and of course that position is going to become very important when World War II starts. And then of course he had Eleanor Roosevelt at his side as well. Okay, so this right here, we're going to look at what are the causes of the Great Depression as seen at that time by FDR, right? So people lose their jobs. We know that. So if they lose their jobs, then fewer goods are being sold because they don't have the money to buy the goods. So if fewer goods are being sold, then there's lower demand. When there's lower demand, the demand drops, then it's difficult for businesses and company. What they do is they either cut wages or they lay people off. And so that means that there are more people losing confidence, losing their jobs. They start saving their money, not spending it. So it's going to, also lead to more people not demanding goods, right? So it's going to kind of continue, sorry, the drop in the demand for different products, right? When that happens, they're forced to make more cuts and more cost-saving things by laying off more people. So even more people lose confidence, and this is this horrible, horrible cycle, right? Where it just kind of depresses down, and that's we get the spiral of depression, right? So here's what they want to do. The government is going to spend money, right? And they're going to do it through all these different alphabet agencies, right? The CCC, the WPA, the PWA, all of these, which are going to employ people. So these people are going to have jobs. If they have jobs and they have money, and if they have money, they're going to spend it. And then the demand for goods is going to go up, right? And then if there's more goods that are demanded, then more are going to be produced. And then so more people have money because you have to hire more people and pay them wages so that they can spend more, right? And so more goods are going to be produced. And as more goods are going to be produced, then there's going to be more jobs. And then more pay equals more taxes, right? And what this is, they believe, is the cycle of prosperity, right? This is how it's going to work. And so they're going to put this into place with the National Industrial Recovery Act, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, where they're kind of setting the prices rather than letting the market set the prices, and they're also setting the wages rather than let the market set the wages. The only problem is that people can't afford this stuff, especially when the price of goods goes up. So anyway, the Democrats call this pump. We're going to prime the pump. And you may not know what that is. It's kind of like if you get a new bottle of lotion, you have to hit it multiple times to get the air out so that the lotion will come through. Well, at this time, people actually had to do that with water. They had to prime the pump that way. So they said, well, we're going to get things rolling. So that was pump priming. All right, so if you look at this, the effects, if it goes anywhere from 25% to 33%. 25% was non-farm labor unemployment. When you put in the farmers who lost their jobs, and 25% of all farmers did, then the unemployment rate would be more like 33%. So it's very, very high. About a quarter of all of the banks failed, and as I said, 25% of the farmers lost their farms. Thousands of businesses closed too. Here, the economy on this one right here, this was from the Department of Commerce, this thing right here. I think this article might have been in The Economist, but it looks here at federal spending, and it shows that the unemployment rates really didn't go below 20% during FDR's whole time in office until they start producing for World War II. So this kind of goes to what I was talking about at the beginning, where it was World War II that brought us out of the Great Depression. Okay, this is the historic unemployment rates in our nation's history, and you can see where it started to climb after 1928, and it goes all the way up here. So it gets at 25%, and this was in 1931. Right at that height. Roosevelt took office in 1932, 1933. He's in. It still had been there for a while. This bump right here, this is what they call the Roosevelt recession, because even though it kind of generally was going down throughout most of his administration, it goes up here. And this is why many economists look and say, well, some of the programs that he did actually made the situation worse. The war breaks out in Europe in 1939, September of 1939, and that is when production really ramps up here in the United States and unemployment goes down. Right now, even with the quarantine, we have less than 5% unemployment in the United States. Depends on how long this is going to last, though. So employment rates are good right now, and historically they're usually about that on average when we have what they call kind of like full employment. Okay, so here's a political cartoon that's kind of funny that you're probably going to see again. This guy right here is Uncle Sam, right? You can tell by his pants. He's got stars on him, and he's always kind of drawn like that. And then we got all of these different elixirs over here. So the National Recovery Act, the CCC, the CWA, all those different things there. And then FDR, of course, is the good doctor coming in. He's got all these New Deal remedies, and he says, we may have to change them up if we don't get the results we want. So he says we're going to do everything we can. And Congress is like, I'll do whatever you say. Because Congress did, it was controlled by the Democrats. They did do whatever he wanted, right? So what he does in these first 100 days, there's lots of legislation to try to bring relief, get people working again, and then recover, get out of the depression, and then we're going to reform so that we don't have the same problems again. We got to reform the stock market. We got to give people pensions, all of that. And Congress helped with everything they could do. So when he first takes office, there's this bank holiday. He shuts them all down from March 6th through the 10th because there had been this huge run on the banks and all banks were failing. So basically, this is a way we wanted to stop the hemorrhaging. Okay, so recovery. What we wanted to do first, go off the gold standard so they can print money and the government can encourage this spending, right? And then we're going to get the WPA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Agricultural Investment Act, all these different acts. Sometimes it's not just relief, recovery, reform. They can cross over. Right? They can do multiple things. And here, another political cartoon, all these different alphabet agencies dancing around FDR. Okay, reform, the Glass-Steagall Act, that's going to kind of change our monetary system. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that's going to insure your money in the bank. We're going to get the Federal Savings and Loan Corporation, kind of the same thing. Security and Exchange Commission, that's going to regulate the stock market. Also, we're going to get the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act. What that's going to do is legalize strikes and collective bargaining. And then also it's going to create a labor board where the government goes in and mediates between business and labor. We're also going to get the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is going to set a minimum wage for the first time in our nation's history and maximum working hours. We're going to get the TVA, which is going to provide electricity, control of flooding, conservation in the Tennessee Valley, and of course the Social Security Administration, which is going to provide pensions for elderly, disabled, and others. Right. So one thing FDR did, I think that was probably one of the best things, is that he really gave people hope and confidence that things were going to be okay. He instilled that in the nation, and the way that he did it is he used the radio, the power of the radio, where he would, go on the radio and he would give these speeches, and he'd be right in the homes of Americans, right? My grandparents talk about sitting around listening to FDR during the Great Depression. Okay, so bank reform, as I said, there was the bank holiday that was put into place. And what they said is that we're going to stop the banks. They cannot open up again until they've been inspected by the federal government, and we make sure that they're solvent so that they're going to be strong and trustworthy. Right. So they also passed the Glass-Steagall Act, and this is something that's still in place today and still is being used. So what it did, it kind of separated investment in commercial and investment banking, right? So if you're investing in the stock market or if you're investing for commercial reasons, right? It also created the FDIC. So what this does is it insures your money in a bank at that time up to $5,000. Now I think it's at $250,000. So wouldn't it be great to have the problem where, oh my gosh, I already have 250,000 in this bank. Guess I'm going to have to go to another bank now to get my money insured there. But the government will insure it. So if a bank goes bad, then the government will insure and you can get it back. If a bank isn't insured, nobody's going to want to go there, right? So it behooves banks to be insured by the FDIC, and then that way too the federal government has regulation over them, right? Another thing that the government did is it bought up gold to increase the value of the dollar, even though they're not on gold standards, right? It still shows that there's trust in the American government. There's backing of that money. Right. Some other banking reform that took place is the Federal Securities Act. This created the Security and Exchange Commission, right? So here it said that banks and businesses had to provide information on their stocks, so there had to be truth in securities, right? And then the agency that oversaw everything is the Security and Exchange Commission. Another one down here at the bottom, Public Utility Holding Company. So what this does is it limits different utilities from functioning in a certain area, right? So you can't have a bunch of different electric companies coming into Monticello because they're going to have lines and cables everywhere, right? So it kind of regulates who can be where based on geography. It also tried to prevent monopolies that way, and the Security and Exchange Commission gets to oversee that as well. So the government's regulating that. Right. This is kind of like the big thing that FDR wanted was the National Industrial Recovery Act. They have this huge parade to set it off, this whole big publicity campaign trying to get people on board with this. The only thing is it was ruled unconstitutional. And it probably didn't work either. This put a lot of people out of business. So what it was is that it suspended all this antitrust legislation, and it said to the industries, regulate yourself, come up with these codes of competition. So set your prices. You know, there had to be a ceiling for prices and a floor for wages. You have to pay your worker at least this much and then your goods that much. So what FDR wanted to do, what they had envisioned, is to kind of take over the economy the way that they did in some industries during World War I. The only thing that they didn't count on, though, is that during World War I, there was increased demand for supplies because of the war production, right, that they needed to do. So there wasn't a demand, and the demand was low because they raised the price of goods, and it put a lot of companies out of business. They also were going to have production quotas. You have to produce this much or that much. So if you're a big company, you could survive in this, but if you're a small business, you couldn't. It was also largely just based on patriotism, trying to encourage people to do this. And so people would put the blue eagle outside of their business and say, I'm a member of the National Recovery or Industrial Recovery Act or the National Recovery Administration. I'm doing this, right? So the administration that was going to oversee this was created as by executive order by Franklin Roosevelt, right? And it also created the PWA, the Public Works Administration. So the National Recovery Administration, this is the one that was supposed to go and enforce the National Industrial Recovery Act, right? This guy named Hugh Johnson was the director of it, and what it did is it was supposed to assist industry, as it says here, labor and unemployment. And as I said, there were ceilings for hours, there were floor for money earned, no yellow dog contracts, and labor was supposed to have the right to go on strike. They weren't getting that because remember, these people were supposed to regulate themselves, right? Businesses said that they were doing what they agreed to, but they actually weren't. And the effect really was increased prices and wages that hurt the economy. and workers, even though they were supposed to be able to strike, they were not. Now, this is going to be ruled unconstitutional by Schechter versus the U.S., but that's not until 1935. Okay, and then there's this. Remember, now farmers had had a hard time for a long time. This is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, and what this wanted to do was to control the amount of crops produced. So what it was going to do is pay farmers not to produce crops. The money to pay for them was going to come from taxing the producers, the processors of food. So if you're raising peanuts and there's too many peanuts on the market, then what you're going to do is we're going to pay the peanut farmer not to grow peanuts, but we're going to tax Jiffy, the manufacturer of peanut butter, right, to do that. So unfortunately, what happened is there's this huge waste of a glut of farm products, right? There's a waste of them on the market. A lot of people become unemployed from this. And as you can see from this cartoon right here, this came out of The Crisis, the magazine for the NAACP. You got a guy with a whip, that's the AAA, who also looks like, you know, the guy on the plantation with the whip, right? The overseer. Many black people in the South worked as tenant farmers. So if the government is paying them not to farm, then these landowners are kicking black people off of their farms, the tenant farmers. And it wasn't just black people, because there are a lot of white people who were tenant farmers too, but they're out, you know, more in the center part of the country. So anyway, eventually in 1936, this is ruled unconstitutional. It goes to the Supreme Court and it's U.S. versus Butler. And what the Supreme Court said that this regulatory taxing on processors is unfair, because to tax one group and not to tax everybody is unconstitutional, right? And to subsidize farmers, they said that's beyond the scope of government. So they're kind of regulating the size and scope of the federal government. And of course, this is going to upset Roosevelt, and that's going to lead to the court packing scheme. Okay, so what they do in 1936 instead, replacing the Agricultural Adjustment Act, is we get the Soil Conservation Domestic Allotment. So again, the goal was conservation, but also to reduce the amount of crops, right? So it required farmers to share a portion of their payments that they received with the government with their sharecroppers. So this, in a sense, also pushed more people off of the farms. This though was challenged. It was approved by the Supreme Court. Okay, and then so in 1938, we're going to get the second Agricultural Adjustment Act. So second Agricultural Act in here. And this was a substitute. So it took specific acreage, right? And restricted cotton, corn, wheat, those sorts of things. They paid them not to, you know, it's kind of done as conservation, but they didn't tax processors. So it wasn't challenged and it was okay. Today, people are paid, farmers are subsidized to not grow crops for certain things, and it's conservation. All right, we're also going to get the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is a federally funded electrical sort of business. And a lot of people are like, this is not the role of the federal government. They didn't see it as that. You know, it's a federally owned power company. It used to be that it was private business that did that sort of thing, but here the federal government is doing it. So what they did is they go into the Tennessee Valley that had been a place with abject poverty for many, many years, right? And poor health and other things. They went down in there. They were going to dam up the Tennessee River for a number of things. One is to create dams that would generate electricity. It would also improve the sewer system. It would control flooding, and it would do some conservation of the land, right? It also gave a lot of people jobs, and it gave people electricity. Okay, so this is the Tennessee Valley, and all these different black marks right here, those are dams. So there's a whole bunch of dams there. And in this part of the country too, there are a bunch of lakes that are there as well that are now used for recreational purposes. Okay, here's another image of it as well, right? Different dams. You can go down to Paducah, right? The southern tip of Illinois, and you can see where there's some dams down there. Okay, and here's, I get weirdly excited about dams, but what they do is they block up a river, right? They do a temporary dam to kind of divert the water while they're building this. But you've got these gates right here. You could either open it or shut it. When it is opened, you allow water to come through, and the power of the water turns these turbines. And these turbines generate the electricity that then is sent out through the power lines and goes to other locations, right? So they create electricity that way. And then back behind the dam, you have a huge lake that is usually used for recreation, fishing, all sorts of things. So they did that. Here's a dam right here, the George Norris Dam. Norris was the Nebraskan senator who advocated government ownership of energy sources, right? So that's one of them. Okay, here's another image of Tennessee Valley Authority lakes that are located all along this region right here. Okay, another thing that was created was the Civilian Conservation Corps. I get weirdly excited about this one too. It was kind of run as a military unit, but they were segregated. I think I liked this so much because I like to hike, and oftentimes the places where we go either camping or hiking or go stay in lodges were built or created by the CCC. So this was for young men, and what they got was $30 a month. They were supposed to send some of that home, right? There were about 500,000 people who took place in this. There were about 2,600 camps. They were run like a military unit. And the one here at the left, this one is in San Diego, California. Um, but um, but this was like from 1933 to 1942. The idea at the time, we're not going to put people on the welfare rolls. FDR thought that's a pox on society. So what we're going to do instead, we're going to give them money for a good day's work. Right, here's some of the camps, up here that kind of look like teepees, the tents, various ones in various parts of the country. This right here is Pere Marquette State Park. This is down in Grafton, Illinois. If you were standing at this doorway and then looking outside, you would be looking at the Illinois River, and people can take their boats right up there and dock them. It's a great lodge. There's a swimming pool in there. There's hiking trails all around. There's a great restaurant, so it's one of my favorite places in Illinois to go to. A nice bike route right along the river there too. It goes from Grafton to Alton and then other places. And then this is my favorite place in Illinois to go. I go up here every year for my birthday, and we go hiking and we look out at the Illinois River and we see eagles. There's a whole bunch of them. But this is the Grand Bear Lodge at Starved Rock. If you go in, this is the inside of the lodge. Right here, you go, that goes back to the restaurant. And they've got a great little pub in there that looks out onto the river, and you can buy the best burgers. Don't go there during the week when it's busy because you get really bad burgers. And there's a whole bunch of people from Chicago. But other than that, it's usually good. Okay, here's a cabin that was built by the CCC at Starved Rock. Still there too. Okay, another one is the PWA. This one was created by the National Industrial Recovery Act, right? And what it did is it employed skilled labor to build these huge structures, right? Like dams and schools and bridges, the Golden Gate Bridge, and those sorts of things. So these are large scale public works projects that, $4 billion put a lot of people to work to help to build our infrastructure. Right, so here they did 70% of the schools, 70% or 35% of hospitals. They built dams. They electrified New York, Washington Railway, 50 military airports, 2 aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, new sewage system in Chicago. And as I said, they hired skilled labor, not like the WPA. That's going to be different. Okay, the guy that ran this is Harold Ickes, and he was the Secretary of the Interior. And I might have gotten this wrong. I'm going to have to check on that one. I think there were Commerce, Interior. I think I got this right. But anyway, skilled jobs, he says, my WPA will give work to unemployed by creating things of lasting use for a nation. And that's true. I mean, there's still a lot of things that were created, almost 90 years ago are still in use today. Okay, Grand Coulee Dam, this is in Washington State. This one right here, this is the Bonneville Power. It's along the Columbia River, not far from where I grew up. This courthouse was created by the WPA, or I'm sorry, the PWA, and then City Hall in St. Petersburg, Florida, PWA. The WPA did some of this too, but this is the PWA. There was also the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Here, a lot of people were losing their homes, right? And so what they did, this thing refinanced them to stop foreclosures. So the way that a foreclosure works is that you have a mortgage where you're making a monthly payment on your house, right? If you don't pay and maybe you've paid everything but $100 on your house and you don't pay that $100, the bank has the right to come in and take your whole house. You lose everything that you had invested in it. And so when they take it, that's called a foreclosure. And so this kind of halted that. People could apply to that. It helped 1 million people keep their homes. This also helped mortgage holding banks so that they wouldn't have all these people who lose their homes. So the government's giving them money to help to refinance these homes. It didn't count for farms, though. It was just, residential homes. All right. We also get the Federal Emergency Relief Act of 1933, and what this was the name given to the Emergency Relief Act, right? And Harry Hopkins, he was the Secretary of Commerce. He ran this, and what it did, this was money that would go out to people who were unemployed. And it also employed people to work for the CWA and the WPA. The WPA we're going to discuss in the next section. Okay. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in section 2.